Why did she hesitate when the order came to fall back? Others moved fast, boots pounding against the mud, their breath short and urgent. She stood still, just for a second no one else noticed except her. The evacuation was chaos, smoke rolling, radios crackling, voices breaking under fear. She should have gone with them, she knew it, but her eyes fixed on something others had missed. A body, not lifeless, not yet. A hand twitched, a face half hidden in the dirt. He was alive. Her squad didn't look back. They couldn't afford to. That was the rule. Leave no one behind except when leaving them was the only way to save the living. She had learned that rule the hard way. Still, her chest tightened. Her legs didn't move. And then quietly she broke the rule. Elena Vargas had never thought of herself as reckless. Others called her steady. A pilot who measured risk. A soldier who kept her voice even when adrenaline spiked through the veins of everyone else. Yet in moments like these, reason slipped away. She crouched beside the wounded man, Corporal Mason, one of the youngest in her unit. His lips were pale, his eyes glassy, but they opened when she touched his shoulder. "Don't," he whispered. "Don't what?" she asked. "Don't stay." Her hands were already moving, checking the bleeding, feeling for the pulse. Weak but there. His chest rose unevenly, like a machine struggling against rust. She didn't answer, not with words, just pressed her hand over the wound and felt his blood warm against her palm. The extraction zone was a half-mile away. She knew the math. With him she'd be late. With him she might not make it. Alone she could have been gone already. But something in her heart pressed louder than orders. Something she'd buried years ago, memories of her brother, the one she hadn't saved. She wouldn't repeat that mistake. Not again. Minutes bled like hours. The smoke thickened. The gunfire in the distance was fatting, her unit pulling further, taking the fight with them. For the first time, silence pressed down like a weight. She tried to lift Mason, his body heavy with limpness. Her muscles trembled. Her throat ached from grit. She told herself this wasn't impossible. She told herself she had carried heavier things, grief, loss, regret. She could carry him. Halfway up the ridge, her breath stuttered. Mason groaned. She lowered him slowly, careful, listening for patrols. The enemy would sweep through soon, and if they found them here. She swallowed. A cold thought slipped in. What if she was wrong to stay? What if both of them died in the dirt where no one would remember their names? Her chest heaved and her eyes stung, but she didn't let go. Not this time. The first flashback struck without warning. It came in the silence between gunfire, the space where her breath echoed too loudly. She was back at 17, her brother's last night. He had been the one who dreamed of flying, not her. He dragged her out to an airfield at midnight, whispering about stars and freedom. She remembered his laugh, his stubbornness. She remembered the day they got the call that his convoy never made it back. She hadn't been there. She hadn't been able to drag him out of the dirt, and part of her had died with him. Her knuckles whitened on Mason's collar. She whispered through gritted teeth, "I'm not leaving you." He opened his eyes again, faint, searching. "You'll die." "Maybe," she said, "but not before I try." Every soldier learns to hide fear behind routine. Pack the gear, check the weapon, scan the horizon. But fear doesn't vanish, it waits. It presses in moments like these when the only sound is your own pulse hammering in your ears. Elena shifted her weight, bracing herself, then hauled Mason again. One step, two. The ridge was endless. Her boots slid against dirt, her shoulders burning. Each breath tasted like rust and smoke. She thought of her squad, already in the air, already counting her as lost. Maybe they'd assume she was gone. Maybe they'd never know she stayed. Her mind whispered, you could have lived, you could have been safe. But safety had never erased guilt. She gritted her teeth, forcing her body forward. One step at a time. Halfway up the ridge she heard it, voices, foreign, close. Her body froze. She lowered Mason carefully, pressing him into the shadow of broken stone. Her hand slipped to her sidearm, slow and quiet, her heart pounding like artillery inside her ribs. Two figures crested the slope above. Their rifles swung loosely, scanning. Their language carried down sharp, clipped. She crouched lower, the smell of Mason's blood mixing with dirt. Her breath caught, shallow, measured. The soldiers paused. One turned his head. For a heartbeat, she thought his eyes found hers. Then he laughed, said something she couldn't catch, and they moved on. She let the silence return, heavy and suffocating. Her lungs finally released. Her hands shook. Mason's eyes fluttered. She whispered, "Still here, still moving." But inside, her thoughts scattered. That had been too close, and the ridge wasn't done with her yet. Darkness came faster than she expected. The smoke had masked the sun, making the sky bleed into gray. Every shadow looked like a figure. Every gust of wind carried imagined footsteps. She dragged Mason into the cover of a shallow ditch, hidden by brush. His breathing rattled, weak. She pulled her canteen, pressing it to his lips. He sipped, coughed, whispered something she couldn't catch. "What?" she asked softly. His eyes rolled, then steadied. "Why'd you stay?" The question cut deeper than any wound. She could have lied. She could have said it was duty or luck or orders, but the truth pressed at her lips, trembling. "Because once," she said quietly, "I didn't." His brow furrowed. He didn't understand. She wasn't sure she wanted him to. She leaned back against the dirt wall, letting exhaustion seep into her bones. Above them, the night crawled in. Somewhere far off, artillery echoed faintly, like thunder in another world. Her eyelids dragged heavy, but she forced them open, scanning, listening. She couldn't sleep, not yet. Her hand traced the grip of her sidearm. The weight was reassuring, though she knew against a patrol it might mean little. She kept one ear tuned to Mason's breathing, shallow and fragile. Each rise of his chest felt like a promise she couldn't break. And in the stillness, her thoughts betrayed her. She thought of her brother again. Of the day she told her mother she was enlisting. Her mother had cried, not because she disapproved, because she knew exactly what it meant, because she'd already buried one child. Elena had promised she'd come back. She'd sworn it. Now, in the dark, that promise felt like glass in her chest. She whispered to herself, so softly Mason couldn't hear, "I'll bring him back. I'll bring both of us back." And for the first time that day, she let herself believe it. The wind picked up. Branches shifted overhead. She tensed. For a moment she thought she saw movement, a silhouette against the night. Her pulse surged, her grip tightened. But the shape faded, just a shadow, just her own fear taking form. She exhaled slowly, pressing her forehead into the dirt. And in that fragile stillness, she realized something. This wasn't about orders anymore. It wasn't even about Mason. It was about her, about proving, maybe to no one else but herself, that she still had the strength to stand when it mattered most. She lifted her head, eyes wet but sharp. The night stretched long ahead, but she was ready. Tomorrow she would move again. But tonight she stayed. How do you measure a night when every second feels borrowed? Elena kept asking herself that as the hours dragged on, her body pressed against the dirt, her ears tuned to every sound. The ditch they hid in was shallow, more a scrape in the earth than a shield. Every gust of wind made the grass whisper. Every creak of the branches above sounded like boots stepping closer. She had always hated waiting. Combat was chaos, yes, but chaos gave you something to do. Action swallowed fear. Waiting made fear grow teeth. Mason stirred beside her. His breaths came ragged, uneven. She pressed two fingers against his neck. The pulse was faint, but it was there, for now. She thought of calling for extraction again, but the radio on her vest was dead weight. She smashed it earlier protocol if capture was a risk. No signals, no trail, only silence. She told herself her squad would regroup at base, that they'd realize she was missing, that someone would send for her, but deep down she knew no one was coming, not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not ever. It was just them. Her, him, and the darkness closing in. A low thud echoed across the ridge. She froze. Not thunder, not artillery, boots. She slid her hand over Mason's mouth, muffling his weak groan. Her other hand gripped the pistol, slick with sweat. She counted the sounds, 2 sets, maybe 3, the crunch of rock under weight, slow, searching. Her heart hammered so loud she swore they'd hear it. The voices came next, harsh, foreign, clipped. She didn't need to understand the words. The tone told her enough. They were hunting. Her body pressed tighter into the dirt, every muscle rigid. Mason shifted under her hand, a quiet whimper escaping. She whispered without sound, "Please, stay quiet, please." The footsteps came closer, closer. Her finger rested on the trigger. She pictured it. 2, maybe 3 shots before they saw her. 2, maybe 3 seconds before the whole ridge knew where she was. She could fight. She could die loud, or she could wait, buried in silence. The boots stopped above the ditch. Her breath caught. One soldier crouched, his rifle sweeping low. The barrel passed just feet from her face. The world shrank to the line of that barrel, the sound of her heartbeat, the taste of copper on her tongue. Then another voice calling from the ridge. The soldier turned his head, paused. And then, mercifully, they moved on. Elena didn't breathe until the last footstep faded. Her lungs burned when she finally let go. She slid her hand from Mason's mouth. He blinked up at her, confusion and fear in his glassy eyes. "We're still here," she whispered, "still breathing." But her hands shook badly. When dawn finally brushed the sky with pale light, she felt hollow. Sleep hadn't come, not even for a second. Her body ached. Her throat was raw from the smoke still clinging to the air. Her uniform was stiff with Mason's blood, dried dark against the fabric. She knew they couldn't stay in the ditch. Patrols would sweep again. And Mason, he was slipping. His skin was clammy, his eyes dull. If she didn't move him, if she didn't find cover, he wouldn't last. She braced herself, slid her arms under him and lifted. Her legs trembled instantly. He was dead weight now. Every step felt like dragging chains. "Come on," she muttered through clenched teeth. "Don't you dare quit on me." Mason groaned, his head lolling against her shoulder. Why are you doing this?" His voice was thin, barely a thread. She didn't answer, not right away. The truth was too raw, too heavy. Finally she whispered, "Because once I didn't." He didn't ask more. He didn't have the strength. But the silence that followed was worse than any interrogation. The terrain shifted as she climbed higher. The ridge opened into a scarred clearing, dotted with the remains of burned-out vehicles. Metal twisted like broken bones. The stench of fuel lingered. She stopped, chest heaving. The clearing was exposed, too open, but crossing it was the only way forward. She set Mason down gently against a piece of charred wreckage. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "Stay here," she said softly. His lips moved. She leaned closer. "Don't leave." Her throat tightened. She pressed a hand to his chest. "I'll be right here, just catching my breath." But she was scanning, searching for movement, listening for the crack of a rifle, the snap of a twig. The silence felt wrong, too heavy, too expectant. She knew she was being watched. Flashbacks came again, unbidden. Her brother's face the night before his last deployment. He'd been joking, teasing her about her clumsy salutes, about how she'd never last a day in uniform. But then his expression had shifted, soft, serious. He said something she'd never forgotten. "Don't let fear decide who you are." She laughed it off back then. But now, kneeling in the wreckage, the words cut deep. Because fear was deciding. Fear was telling her to run, to hide, to give up Mason for her own survival. And she was refusing. Not because she was fearless, but because she couldn't bear the weight of failing again. A crow's caw split the silence. She flinched, gun up, heart racing, just a bird. She almost laughed, almost. Then the shot rang out. The bullet smacked into the wreckage inches from Mason's head. Sparks spat. She dropped low, dragging him flat. Another shot cracked, this one carving dirt inches from her arm. "Sniper!" She cursed under her breath, crawled closer to Mason, covering him with her body. Her mind raced. The clearing was a kill zone. She should have known. Whoever was out there had the angles, the patience, and she was trapped. She pressed her cheek against the dirt, listening, waiting. The silence stretched. The sniper was waiting too. Her options flickered like cards in her head. She could make a run for it, suicide. She could wait death by slow bleed, or she could distract, risk everything for one shot. Her fingers brushed the last smoke grenade clipped to her vest. She hadn't used it yesterday, saving it for a moment she couldn't define. Maybe this was it. She glanced at Mason. His lips were blue now, his chest barely lifted. There was no time left to weigh choices. She pulled the pin. The smoke burst wide, thick, curling upward. She grabbed Mason under the arms and dragged with every ounce of strength left in her body. Her muscles screamed. Her lungs burned. The sniper fired, blind this time. The bullet whined off metal. Another cracked against stone. Too close. She kept moving, dragging, crawling. The smoke wrapped them in a fragile cocoon. Not safety, not really, but hope. For the first time in hours, she let herself believe hope might be enough. They reached the far edge of the clearing, collapsing behind a ridge of stone. She fell beside Mason, chest heaving, sweat and dirt streaking her face. For a moment she just lay there, staring at the sky. The smoke thinned above, dispersing into the pale dawn. Her hand found Mason's wrist. The pulse was faint, fainter than before. She bit back a sob, shook him gently. "Stay with me, please, don't make me do this for nothing." His eyes flickered open, just barely, his lips parted. "Why you?" The words slurred, broken. She swallowed hard. She thought of her brother, of her promise, of the way she had failed once and swore never to again. "Because someone has to," she whispered. Her voice cracked. And for the first time, she realized it wasn't just Mason she was saving. It was herself. The sun finally broke over the ridge, casting everything in gold. For a second it felt almost beautiful, almost peaceful. But Elena knew peace was a lie. The sniper was still out there. The patrols would return. And Mason was dying. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing dirt and tears alike. Then she stood, legs trembling but firm. She would move again. She would fight again. She would carry him until there was nothing left of her to give. Because love in its fiercest, truest form wasn't soft. It was brutal. It was sacrifice. And she was ready to pay the cost. The briefing room had fallen into that peculiar hush that was never truly silent. The hum of the overhead lights, the faint shuffle of boots against the concrete floor, the scrape of a chair, all those tiny sounds filled the void. But beneath them ran something else, a current of tension so sharp it felt like it could snap at any moment. At the head of the long table, Colonel Draven leaned forward, his gloved hands pressed flat against the surface as if he could force his authority into the steel. His eyes burned with restrained fury, but his voice remained low, measured. "Do you understand what you've done, Lieutenant?" Lee Monroe sat at the far end, back straight, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on a point just above his shoulder. She hadn't flinched when his fist slammed the table earlier. She hadn't blinked when the rest of the officers muttered about her, their voices dripping with disdain. And she didn't react now, though inside, the weight of silence pressed on her chest like a stone. She had been trained for this: silence, restraint, control. The Omega program had carved it into her bones when she was barely more than a girl. Speak only when necessary. Reveal nothing. Let them underestimate you. And right now, they did. Every single man in that room looked at her like she was either a problem to be solved or an inconvenience to be erased. None of them knew what her silence really carried. Captain Torres broke first. She always did. A proud, sharp-featured woman with a voice that cut like a blade, she slammed her folder down on the table. She disobeyed orders, Colonel. That alone is grounds for removal. We can't run an operation with someone who thinks she knows better than command. Lee finally moved, her hands curling into fists under the table where no one could see. Her throat ached to answer, to defend herself, but she forced the words back. If she spoke too soon, it would be anger, not clarity. And anger was exactly what they wanted her to fall into. Draven's gaze didn't leave her. Lieutenant Monroe, I'll give you one chance to explain why you disregarded a direct order on the ground. One chance. The room waited, eyes bore into her, searching for cracks. Lee inhaled slowly. She remembered the ambush, the screams, the way the intel had been wrong, deadly wrong. If she hadn't shifted her squad 2 clicks east, they'd be corpses in the mud right now. But she also remembered something else. The moment when she saw the trap, not just with her eyes but with that other sense. The one Omega had awakened. The one no one was supposed to know about. Her silence stretched. Someone coughed. Torres muttered under her breath. Finally, Lee lifted her chin, her voice calm, even deliberate. Because the order would have gotten them killed. Draven's eyes narrowed. And what makes you the arbiter of life and death, Lieutenant? You're a soldier. You follow orders. The word soldier dug into her like a thorn. She was a soldier, yes, but she was also something else. Something built in the shadows of a war no one admitted ever happened. She could see angles, patterns, outcomes before they unfolded, and she had seen this one. Lee's silence returned, heavier than before. She would not explain, not here, not yet. It was Torres again who pushed, voice sharp with disdain. Colonel, she's hiding something. Look at her. No hesitation, no remorse. It's not confidence, it's arrogance. I've seen this before, operatives who think they're untouchable. They all crack eventually. Lee's eyes flicked toward Torres just for a moment, and in that moment, Torres faltered. There was something in Lee's gaze, something unspoken but undeniable, that pulled the air out of her accusation. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't arrogance, it was certainty. Draven finally straightened, the leather of his gloves creaking as he crossed his arms. His face was carved from stone, unreadable. Dismissed, all of you except Monroe. Chairs scraped, papers shuffled. Torres lingered, clearly wanting the last word, but Draven's glare sent her stalking out in silence. The door closed, and suddenly the room felt cavernous, the air dense. Draven studied her. For a long time neither spoke. Then slowly he moved to sit opposite her. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its edge. It was quieter, almost cautious. You knew, didn't you? Lee's breath caught, not at the question itself but at the way he asked it, not accusatory, not demanding, almost resigned. Sorry. His eyes bored into hers. You didn't just guess, you didn't just make a lucky call, you knew that ambush was there. How? Her mouth went dry, she could lie, she could deflect, but something in his tone made her hesitate. Draven leaned back, exhaling like a man carrying a weight only he knew. This isn't the first time. Reports from your last 3 deployments read the same. Decisions no one else would have made, calls that shouldn't have worked but they did. Men alive who should be dead. Missions salvaged that should have failed. He let the silence hang before finishing. That doesn't happen by accident. Lee's heartbeat thundered in her ears. She had trained herself to hold her breath through interrogations, to regulate her pulse under duress. But right now, she felt the edges of her carefully built armor bending. Sir, I follow instinct, that's all. It was the safest answer she could give. Draven's eyes softened just barely. Instinct doesn't look like certainty, Lieutenant, and you looked certain. The silence grew unbearable. Lee dropped her gaze, staring at her hands. She remembered the experiments, the endless drills, the voices in her ear telling her what she could be if she just let go. She remembered the cold metal room where she had been told she was no longer just Lee Monroe. She was Omega. But no one could ever know. Draven stood, his chair scraping back. He rested a hand on the table and leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Whatever it is you're carrying, Lieutenant, you don't have to carry it alone. Not anymore. The words hit her harder than any reprimand. For the first time in years, something cracked. A sliver, just enough to sting her eyes before she blinked it back. He left her there, silent and still, with the weight of those words pressing into her chest. The barracks were dark when Lee finally returned. Her squad was asleep, their breathing steady, the room heavy with the smell of sweat and metal. She sat on her bunk, elbows on her knees, staring at the floor. Her hand drifted to the inside pocket of her jacket. The small case was still there, cool against her palm. She pulled it out, flipping it open just enough to see the metal inside. Not regulation issue, not officially acknowledged. A token from a war no one admitted had been fought, a metal that wasn't supposed to exist. Her fingers trembled as she closed it again. She shoved it back into her pocket, pressing it against her chest like it could anchor her. She thought of Draven's words, "You don't have to carry it alone." But she did. She had to, because if the truth ever came out, if anyone knew what she really was, it wouldn't just be her career at stake. It would be everything. The next morning, her squad eyed her with quiet curiosity as she moved through drills. No one said it out loud, but rumors traveled fast, and everyone knew she had been kept behind after the briefing. Private Rios, the youngest of them, lingered near her during weapons inspection. His voice was low, tentative. "Ma'am, you saved us out there. Doesn't matter what anyone says." Lee glanced at him, caught off guard. His face was earnest, open in a way most soldiers lost after their first deployment. He didn't know what he was saying, not really. But somehow, his words chipped another crack into the wall she had built. She gave the faintest nod. No words, but for Rios it was enough. That night Lee lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of her squads breathing around her. The silence was no longer heavy. It was alive, filled with the pulse of trust she hadn't felt in years. But beneath it all the weight remained. The secret still burned, and she knew sooner or later it would surface. Morning broke with the kind of pale gray light that seemed to strip color from everything it touched. The base came alive in layers, boots striking pavement, engines humming awake, orders barked across the courtyard. But beneath the rhythm of daily operations, Lee Monroe could feel it. The shift, the eyes, the quiet suspicion curling through the ranks like smoke. She had been through this before. Not here, not with these people, but in training, in deployment, in the shadows where secrets lived. Once someone suspected you were different, that you carried something they couldn't explain, it spread. First a whisper, then a rumor, then a stain that no amount of loyalty could wash away. And this time she couldn't run. The squad was gearing up for a live-fire exercise, moving through their checks with the half-awake efficiency of seasoned soldiers. Lee knelt by her rifle, stripping it down piece by piece, her movements precise, deliberate. Every clink of metal on the bench was a tether, keeping her grounded. Private Rios slid onto the bench beside her, his own gear sprawled out in a chaotic mess. He was young, too young for the scars on his hands, but there was a steadiness in his eyes she had started to respect. "Ma'am," he said quietly, not looking up from his rifle, "people are talking." Lee didn't pause. People always talk. "This feels different." He risked a glance at her, his brow furrowed. "They're saying you knew about the ambush, like you've got a pipeline no one else does." Lee's hand slowed for just a fraction of a second. "And what do you think, Private?" Rios shrugged, forcing a grin. "I think I'd rather follow someone who gets us home alive than someone who follows the book into a grave." His words hit harder than he probably realized. She didn't answer, just clicked the bolt back into place and handed him a cleaning cloth. He accepted it with a lopsided smile, and for a moment the tension in her chest eased. But when she glanced up, she caught Sergeant Hale watching from across the bay. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes lingered too long before he turned back to his gear. The smoke was spreading. The exercise was brutal by design. Simulated urban combat across a sprawling training field wired with traps, drones, and blank-fire turrets. The kind of environment where hesitation meant failure, and failure meant paperwork none of them wanted. Lee led her squad through the first sector, her senses sharp, body moving with the muscle memory of years. The cityscape was a labyrinth of shattered concrete and steel scaffolding, and every corner reeked of staged danger. They advanced in formation, Tor's barking adjustments from behind. Lee ignored her, letting instinct guide her instead. At the third alley, she halted abruptly, hand raised. "Hold!" Her squad froze. "What the hell are you doing, Monroe?" Tor snapped through comms. "We're on a timer." Lee's eyes scanned the alley. On the surface, it looked clear, too clear. A stack of crates near the far wall, a shadow that didn't quite match its source. She felt the weight in her chest, the same certainty she had felt before the ambush. "Trip sensors right side," Lee said evenly. "Turrets above." "Nothing on the scanners," Tor's bit back. "Because they're running dark. Move left 2 by 2. There was a beat of silence. Then Rios moved without hesitation, trusting her call. The others followed, wary but obedient. They slipped through the adjoining passage just as the alley erupted, 3 turrets snapping awake, spewing blanks into the empty street. Lee didn't even flinch. When they regrouped on the far side, the squad looked at her differently. Not with suspicion this time, with something closer to awe. Tor's, though, looked like she was ready to explode. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she spat, ripping off her helmet as soon as the drill ended. "Making me look like a fool in front of my own men." Lee removed her own gear slowly, deliberately, her face calm. "I kept them alive. That's all that matters." Tor stepped closer, eyes blazing. "No, what matters is order, command, chain of authority, and you keep breaking it like it doesn't apply to you." The squad shifted uncomfortably, the air thick with unspoken words. Lee met Tor's glare without blinking. Her silence was louder than any retort. Finally Tor's hissed, "You're not a soldier, you're something else, and I'll find out what." She stormed off, leaving the squad staring at Lee, caught between loyalty and doubt. That night, Lee sat alone in the mess hall long after most had left. The room echoed with the clatter of trays and the distant hum of the refrigeration units. Her untouched food sat cold in front of her. Her mind replayed Tor's words on a loop, "You're not a soldier." It was the same accusation she had once whispered to herself in the dead of night, staring into a mirror she barely recognized. The Omega program hadn't made her less human, but it had made her feel like it. Every time she predicted a move before it happened, every time she sensed a threat no one else could see, she was reminded she was different. And different was dangerous. The door creaked. Colonel Draven entered, his presence filling the empty space like a storm cloud. He didn't carry a tray. Didn't need to. He came straight to her table and sat across from her without a word. They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally he said, "Tor's filed a report." Lee's jaw tightened. "Of course she did." "She claims you have access to intel not available to the rest of the unit." His eyes narrowed. "Is she right?" Lee forced her breathing to remain steady. "No, sir. I rely on instinct and experience, that's all." Draven studied her, his expression unreadable. Instinct doesn't trigger trip sensors. Instinct doesn't read the battlefield like a map. Lee's fingers curled into her palms under the table. She wanted to tell him. Part of her even ached to spill everything, to drop the weight she'd carried alone for so long. But she couldn't. If she said it aloud, it became real, documented, controlled. and then she'd lose everything. Instead, she said quietly, "With respect, sir, my record speaks for itself. Every decision I've made has kept my squad alive." Draven's gaze softened just slightly, enough to remind her of the words he'd said before, "You don't have to carry it alone." But then his voice hardened again. "Be careful, Lieutenant. Shadows like this have a way of swallowing soldiers whole." He stood and left her with her untouched meal and the crushing weight of his warning. The days blurred into one another, drills, briefings, silent stares in the hallways. Lee could feel the fracture widening. Some of the squad trusted her more than ever. Others watched her with unease, waiting for her to slip. Tors became bolder, whispering just loud enough for others to hear, planting seeds of doubt wherever she could. Hale grew more distant, his silence heavier than words. Only Rios remained steadfast, shadowing her like a younger brother who refused to see the cracks. But the worst was the dreams. At night, Lee saw flashes of the Omega facility, the sterile white walls, the endless drills, the cold voices calling her by a number instead of her name. She woke with her chest tight, the phantom echo of electrodes still buzzing under her skin. One morning, as she splashed water on her face in the barracks bathroom, she caught her reflection in the cracked mirror. For a heartbeat, she didn't see herself. She saw the version they had built, the one who could never belong anywhere but the shadows. And for the first time in years, she wondered if Tors was right. The breaking point came during a night patrol. The squad was moving through the perimeter woods, their flashlights slicing thin beams through the trees. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of pine and earth. Halfway through, Lee froze. Something was wrong. Not a sound, not a sight, just the shift, the weight in her chest that told her danger was near. She raised her fist, signaling halt. "Not again," Tors muttered. "You don't get to stop us on a feeling." Lee ignored her, scanning the darkness. Her hand drifted toward her sidearm. "Lieutenant," Hale said, his voice steady but questioning, "what do you see?" Lee opened her mouth, but before she could answer, a flare burst overhead, bathing the woods in harsh red light. It wasn't part of the drill. The squad snapped to alert, weapons raised, hearts pounding. Tor's face twisted, caught between vindication and fear. Lee's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Defensive positions, now." They obeyed, not because of orders, because of her. As the flare burned above them, Lee felt it again. The certainty, the knowledge that something bigger was moving in the shadows. And this time, there would be no hiding. The flare hissed out above the tree line, leaving behind a trail of smoke that curled against the night sky. Then darkness reclaimed the woods. Thick, heavy, suffocating. Every soldier felt it, the kind of silence that made your heart pound louder than your boots. Rios's breath came fast over comms. "That wasn't ours." "No," Lee said, her voice low but unshaking. "It was." She could hear the forest itself holding its breath. No wind, no crickets, no rustle of leaves, just the creak of their gear, the weight of their fear, and the echo of her own heartbeat. She knew this wasn't a drill, not anymore. And she knew, with the same gnawing certainty that had haunted her since Omega, that something was out there, watching them. "Tors, get your men spread, 50-meter perimeter," Lee ordered. Tors glared at her through the red haze of her visor light. "You don't give me orders." "Then die where you stand." Lee's reply was sharp, colder than she intended. For a moment they stared at each other, then Hale's voice cut through. "Do it, Tors." Reluctantly, Tors relayed the command. Soldiers fanned out, rifles aimed into the black. The beams of their flashlights barely pierced the trees, shaking with the tremor of hands not quite steady. Lee dropped to one knee, her palm brushing the ground. She didn't know why she did it. Instinct, memory, something deeper. The earth was damp, still trembling faintly from movement too far away to hear. She felt it in her bones. This was no coincidence. "What do you see?" Hale asked quietly, crouching beside her. Lee's throat tightened. She wanted to lie, to shrug it off, to say it was just nerves, but that would be another betrayal, and she was tired of lying. Instead, she whispered, "They're circling us." The first shot cracked from the trees, a snap, sharp and merciless, that tore through the silence. Bark exploded off a trunk inches from Rios's head. He dropped behind cover, swearing. Contact northeast. The squad erupted in return fire, bullets carving bright trails through the dark. Shadows darted between the trees, too fast, too precise for a simple drill. Whoever these enemies were, they knew the terrain. Lee fired short, controlled bursts, her mind running faster than her rifle. How many? Where? Why here? The questions tangled, but one answer screamed louder than the rest. This was no accident. Someone had led them into it. The firefight raged, chaos swallowing command structure. Soldiers shouted over each other, the crack of rifles blending with the sharp stink of cordite. Flashes lit faces twisted in fear, in rage, in disbelief. Through it all, Lee stayed steady. Calm, too calm. Moving where the squad faltered, predicting flanks before they appeared, dragging two wounded back behind cover with a strength she didn't know she had. It was Rios who noticed first. "Ma'am," he reloaded clumsily, eyes wide. "It's like you knew they'd." His voice cracked as another round whizzed past. He didn't finish the thought, but the look he gave her said everything. Minutes felt like hours. The squad pushed back inch by inch until the attackers finally melted into the trees. Silence returned, but it wasn't peace. It was heavier, darker, the kind that left you listening for ghosts. Tor stormed toward Lee, helmet gone, face slick with sweat. She jabbed a finger into Lee's chest. "You knew, don't you dare tell me you did." Lee swatted her hand away. "I reacted, that's all." "Bull," Tor's voice shook, her fury edged with fear. "Nobody reacts like that, not unless they're in on it." The squad shifted uneasily, eyes flicking between the two women. The accusation hung in the air like a knife. Lee didn't answer, couldn't. The truth would break them more than any bullet. It was Hale who stepped forward, voice calm but firm. "Enough, save it for command." Tor's looked like she wanted to argue, but she stopped. Her silence was worse than her shouting. They limped back to base with two wounded carried between them. No one spoke. Not about the ambush, not about the flare, not about Lee. The night swallowed their voices, leaving only the crunch of boots and the distant call of owls. But Lee's mind didn't stop. It spun faster, unraveling threads she tried so hard to keep knotted. Someone had tipped the enemy. Someone had known their patrol route, their timing, their weaknesses. And whoever it was, they hadn't counted on her. The realization chilled her, because that meant this wasn't about her past, not about Omega. It was happening now. Back at base, the debrief was brutal. Colonel Draven's face was carved from stone as he listened to conflicting accounts. Tor swearing Lee had advanced knowledge, Hale offering measured defense, Rios vouching for her with a trembling but earnest voice. Lee stayed silent. She could feel every eye on her, every word sharpening into a blade at her throat. Finally, Draven dismissed the squad, keeping Lee back. The room felt cavernous once they were gone, the hum of fluorescent lights drilling into her skull. "Sit," he said. She did. Her hands rested on her knees, steady only because she forced them to be. "Tell me what happened." Lee's voice was even. "We were ambushed," I reacted. Draven leaned forward, his eyes dark. "You knew." It wasn't a question. Lee's lips parted, but no sound came. The weight in her chest threatened to crush her. This was it, the moment she'd feared since Omega, the moment her secret became a weapon against her. But then Draven's tone softened, almost imperceptibly. "I'm not asking for the report, I'm asking for the truth." Her throat ached. She wanted to tell him everything. The experiments, the conditioning, the endless drills that had sharpened her instincts into something unnatural. She wanted someone else to carry it, just for a moment. But she saw Tor's face in her mind. heard the whispers in the barracks, felt the judgment in every sideways glance. And she knew if she spoke she'd be done, not just as a soldier, as a person. So she said, barely above a whisper, "I got lucky." Draven's jaw tightened. His disappointment cut deeper than anger, but he didn't press. Instead, he stood, his voice low. "Luck runs out, Lieutenant, remember that." He left her in the empty room, the silence louder than any interrogation. That night Lee couldn't sleep. She sat on her bunk, staring at the faint glow of the barracks light filtering through the blinds. Rios snored softly on the cot across from hers. Tors lay stiff, awake, pretending not to watch her. Lee's chest felt hollow, not from fear, from something worse, doubt. Maybe Tors was right. Maybe she didn't belong here, not with them, not anywhere. She pressed her palms to her eyes, fighting the burn of tears she wouldn't allow. She had survived Omega, survived deployments, survived the silence of secrets eating her alive. But this slow fracture of trust, this suspicion turning her own squad into strangers, it felt like the one thing she couldn't outlast. Her mind whispered the question she didn't want to hear. How much longer until they turn on you completely? At dawn, a new order came down. The squad was being deployed forward. Real mission, real stakes. Lee stood among them on the tarmac, gear strapped, rifle slung, the roar of transport rotors shaking the air. The sun rose blood orange over the horizon, painting their faces in firelight. Rios looked nervous but determined. Hale stood stoic, unreadable, Tor's glare cut like steel. Lee pulled her helmet on, the world narrowing to the sound of her own breath. She felt the weight of everything, Omega, the ambush, the secret that chained her soul. And somewhere in that weight, buried deep, was a question that made her chest ache. If it came down to it, would she stay behind for them, even if they never truly trusted her? The engines roared louder, drowning out thought. The squad boarded. The mission awaited. And Lee knew, with a clarity that shook her, that the choice was coming sooner than she wanted. The transport dropped them at the edge of the valley just as the first light of dawn sliced across the jagged cliffs. Mist clung to the ground, curling around rocks like spectral fingers. Lee Monroe stepped onto the soil, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The squad fanned out silently, rifles ready, each soldier carrying the unspoken tension of what was coming. The valley was deceptively calm. Birds chirped faintly, but Lee knew better. Calm was the precursor to chaos. She adjusted her helmet, her fingers brushing against the metal hidden in the inner pocket of her jacket. A small token from a past war, a reminder that she had survived things no one else could understand. She pressed it to her chest, drawing a sliver of courage from it. Rios moved beside her, scanning the perimeter nervously. "Ma'am, feels wrong here," he whispered. Lee didn't reply. She couldn't. Words were a liability in moments like this. Her senses stretched, every shadow, every ripple in the mist a potential threat. She felt it, the same instinct she'd learned to trust when Omega had taught her to survive. Something was waiting, watching, calculating. The mission was simple in theory. Secure the ridge overlooking the enemy encampment and provide reconnaissance. But Lee knew better. Nothing in war was ever simple. They moved forward, the squad silent ghosts among the rocks and mist. Tors was at the rear, eyes darting constantly, a mixture of irritation and fear etched across her face. Hale flanked the other side, stoic as ever, giving nothing away. Rios's grip on his rifle was tight enough to whiten his knuckles. Suddenly Lee froze, her breath caught in her throat. A faint vibration ran along the ground, a subtle rhythm, almost imperceptible, but enough to set her nerves on edge. She gestured sharply for the squad to halt. Tor snorted. "Again, what is it this time, Monroe? A bad dream?" Lee ignored her. She crouched low, scanning the valley floor. The mist thickened, concealing movement. Then she saw it, a flash just for a heartbeat between the rocks. "Enemy scouts," she whispered. "2, maybe 3, northeast, light infantry." Before anyone could respond, a sharp crack rang out. A sniper's shot. The rock next to Rio's exploded in splinters, sending him sprawling. Lee lunged, dragging him behind cover, her heart pounding in a rhythm that matched the distant drums of the valley. "Contact North Ridge, incoming," Torres shouted, finally moving into action. Lee's mind was razor-sharp, every move calculated, every breath controlled. She directed her squad, splitting them into suppressive positions, covering fire, flanking routes. The mist worked to their advantage, masking their movement, but it also hid the enemy. The shadows were alive, shifting, striking with precision. A flurry of gunfire erupted, deafening in the confined valley. The scent of cordite mixed with the damp earth. She could hear the bullets whistling past, the distant screams, the grunt of effort, and the raw terror that only real combat could bring. Lee moved like a shadow, pulling Rios to the next cover, dragging him through the mud. Blood slicked his uniform where a grazing shot had nicked his shoulder. He hissed but didn't cry out. She could see the raw fear in his eyes, the conflict of wanting to survive yet wanting to trust her lead. "Keep moving, follow my lead," she barked, voice calm but sharp. Every word counted, every syllable a lifeline in the chaos. The enemy emerged from the mist, light infantry armed with rifles and explosives, moving with a calculated precision that made Lee's instincts scream. But she had faced worse. She had survived worse. And she would survive this. She sighted down her rifle, calculating trajectories with uncanny accuracy. Shots rang out, each one precise, controlled. She moved, ducking, rolling, firing, guiding her squad with silent hand signals when words would have betrayed their position. The first enemy went down silently, a single shot through the chest. Another fell moments later, taken by Rios, who had regained some measure of control. Hale provided cover fire, his calm presence a stabilizing force. Torres, despite her earlier hostility, followed orders, her rifle shaking slightly as she aimed and fired. Lee's mind flashed to Draven's words from before. "Luck runs out, Lieutenant. Remember that." She pushed the thought aside. Luck had nothing to do with survival. Skill, instinct, and sacrifice, that was what kept soldiers alive. And sacrifice was exactly what she might have to give. Another flare shot up from the valley floor, and this time it illuminated the enemy's full force. Dozens of soldiers moving in formation, flanking from the ridge above. Lee's stomach dropped. They were surrounded. She calculated rapidly. Retreat would be deadly. Stand and fight meant attrition. But if they held the ridge, they could control the valley and call in support. It was a gamble, but there was no other choice. "Hold the ridge at all costs," she shouted. "Positions now." The squad scrambled, bullets tearing through the mist. Lee moved among them, adjusting positions, pulling the wounded to safety, firing, reloading, thinking 10 steps ahead. Her body was on autopilot, muscle memory guiding her through the chaos. Rio stumbled, his leg grazed by a bullet. Lee dropped to him instantly, dragging him behind a rock, pressing her hand against the wound to slow the bleeding. "You're not dying here," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Torres hesitated, caught in the middle of panic and obedience. Lee's eyes met hers. No words, just a look that carried everything. "Move. Now, trust me." Torres nodded, finding the courage to fire again, taking down 2 enemies advancing through the mist. Minutes stretched like hours. The valley became a nightmare of shadows, gunfire, and fear. Lee's mind was a razor's edge, calculating, predicting, sacrificing sleep and doubt for every decision. And then she saw it, the wounded, a squad pinned behind debris, their bodies vulnerable to the flanking enemy. Her heart clenched. She could have kept her squad safe, maintained their defensive position, and survived. But she couldn't abandon them, not after everything. "Cover me," she shouted to Hale and Torres. Without waiting for a response, she sprinted across open ground, bullets whistling past, dust and dirt exploding around her. She reached the wounded, checking each one quickly, applying pressure, dragging them toward cover. Rios followed, gritting his teeth against fear, but moved as she had shown him. The others provided covering fire, suppressing the enemy long enough for them to reach relative safety. Lee's chest burned. Blood, sweat, mud, they mixed into a haze that made the world edge-on sharp. She didn't stop, she couldn't. A sniper's shot cracked nearby. The impact sent her sprawling, chest against the ground, ears ringing, but she got up. She would not be stopped, not now, not ever. The squad finally consolidated on the ridge, wounded stabilized, positions held. The enemy had been repelled, at least temporarily. Lee's body trembled from exhaustion and adrenaline, but she didn't allow herself to collapse. She knelt, checking Rios again, pressing her hand to the bleeding, whispering reassurances she didn't quite believe. Hale approached her, his face grim but respectful. "You did well, Monroe. You kept them alive." She shook her head, her eyes scanning the valley below. "We're not safe, not yet, not until they're gone." Tors, her uniform torn and bloodied, stepped beside her. She didn't speak, but her nod carried grudging respect. Lee caught the weight of it and allowed herself a brief, fleeting acknowledgement. The sun broke fully over the cliffs, painting the valley in harsh, unrelenting light. Shadows fled, but Lee's chest still carried the darkness of the night's events. She had survived. Her squad had survived. But she knew, deep down, that every choice she had made, every instinct she had trusted had come at a cost, not just physical but moral. Sometimes duty demanded more than obedience. Sometimes survival required sacrifice. And sometimes the greatest act of duty wasn't victory, it was staying behind for those who could not move on their own. Lee pressed her hand to the metal in her pocket, feeling its weight. It was small, but it was proof. Proof that she carried more than orders, more than fear, more than instinct. She carried love, responsibility, and the unspoken bond that tied her to every life she vowed to protect. The valley lay quiet now, the mist retreating, but the echoes of battle lingered in every rock, every tree. Lee stood, shoulders squared, eyes on the horizon. The fight wasn't over. It never was. But for now she had made it through, and sometimes that was enough. Why did silence feel heavier than the gunfire had? The valley was quiet now, but Lee Monroe could still feel the echoes of bullets and screams reverberating through her chest. Each breath she took was a reminder of lives she had dragged back from the edge. Lives she had saved at the expense of her own exhaustion, at the expense of the fragile trust that held the squad together. They had made it back to the forward operating base, their wounded stabilized in the med bay, but the air was thick with tension. Soldiers moved around them in mechanical patterns, avoiding eye contact, whispering just loud enough to be heard. Some looked at Lee with awe, some with suspicion, some with unspoken fear. She could feel it, the slow fracture of the bonds that should have held them as one. Hale approached, silent as ever, his presence more grounding than anything else in the room. "You did everything you could," he said quietly. Not a compliment, not a reprimand, just a statement of fact, and in its simplicity it carried weight. Lee shook her head. Did I really?" Her voice cracked, barely audible above the hum of fluorescent lights. "I left half of them exposed. I dragged them across open ground. She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "You saved them," Rio said softly from his cot, where he was tending to a shallow wound on his arm. His eyes were tired but steady. "And if it weren't for you, I wouldn't even be talking to you right now." Lee looked at him and saw fear, yes, but also trust. The kind of trust she had fought to earn in the fires of countless missions. And yet, it wasn't enough to calm the storm inside her. Not when every glance from Tors reminded her that suspicion was still alive, still gnawing at the edges of their unity. Tors stood near the door, arms crossed, her jaw tight. She said nothing, but the weight of her stare was palpable. Lee knew the words that Tors wanted to speak. Accusations, challenges, doubts. But for now, Tors held her tongue, and in that Lee found a small reprieve. Hours passed in a blur of debriefings, medical checks, and the quiet bustle of a base that had survived one day only to prepare for another. Lee sat alone on the edge of the mess hall, staring at her hands. Every cut, every bruise, every ache in her body was a reminder of what had transpired. But it wasn't the physical pain that haunted her. It was the choices she had made, the weight of responsibility. The knowledge that, no matter what, she had stayed behind when it could have been easier to move on, to save herself. Hale approached, sitting on the bench beside her. "You're carrying too much." "I have to," she replied. "If I don't, no one else will. That's what duty is, isn't it? Not glory, not medals, not respect. Just doing the right thing when no one is looking." Hale didn't respond immediately. He understood. He had seen it before, in other soldiers who carried the weight of others on their shoulders, and he knew that weight could crush a person if they weren't careful. "You also need to remember," he said finally, "that you can't save everyone. And sometimes survival isn't a moral failing, it's just survival." Lee nodded, though her heart disagreed. Survival was never enough. Not when you could reach out and pull someone back from the brink. Not when leaving them behind was an option you refused to take. Later, Lee found herself walking the perimeter alone. The base was quiet, save for the distant hum of generators and the occasional shuffle of a soldier on patrol. The night air was cold, crisp, and carried the scent of pine and dirt from the surrounding valley. She pressed her hands to her chest, feeling the weight of the metal that rested there, hidden beneath her uniform. It was small, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it carried the memory of every sacrifice she had made, every life she had saved, and every choice she had agonized over. She stopped at the edge of the ridge, overlooking the valley where the ambush had occurred. The moonlight painted the landscape in silver and shadow, highlighting the jagged rocks and the faint outline of the river below. Lee could still see the ghosts of that night, the flash of muzzle fire, the screams, the terror in the eyes of soldiers who had relied on her instinct to survive. Her mind drifted to Omega, to the countless hours of training and conditioning that had shaped her into the soldier she had become. She remembered the cold, sterile walls, the endless drills, the voices that had called her a number instead of a name. And she realized that, despite all of that, she had retained something they could never take: her humanity, her ability to care, to act out of love rather than duty alone. The next morning brought orders for redeployment. The mission was far from over. Intelligence indicated that the enemy forces were regrouping, planning another offensive that could trap her squad in the valley. Lee's stomach tightened. Every decision she made now carried the potential to tip the balance between life and death. The squad assembled quickly, their faces tired but resolute. Rios met her eyes, giving a small nod of encouragement. Hale's expression remained unreadable, but his presence was a silent anchor. Torres lingered at the rear, her eyes cold, but there was a flicker of something beneath the surface. Perhaps respect, perhaps fear, perhaps a grudging acknowledgement of Lee's unspoken leadership. As they moved out, Lee's mind raced. She had to anticipate every move, every threat, every possibility. The valley was familiar now, its contours etched into her memory, but familiarity bred danger as much as it did confidence. She had to remain vigilant. She had to protect her squad. She had to stay alive, not for herself, but for them. The enemy struck at midday. It was swift, brutal, and calculated. Explosions shattered the calm, sending plumes of smoke and debris into the air. Soldiers shouted over the chaos, their voices mingling with the deafening roar of artillery and the sharp crack of rifle fire. Lee moved through the battlefield like a shadow, her instincts guiding her every step. She pulled the wounded to cover, fired with precision, and coordinated her squad's movements with silent hand signals. Every decision was a balance between risk and reward, between life and death. Rios took a hit to the leg and Lee didn't hesitate. She dragged him behind a fallen wall, pressing her hand to his wound, whispering reassurances as bullets whizzed past. Torres provided covering fire, her shots steady despite the chaos. Hail flanked the ridge, taking down enemies with surgical precision. And through it all, Lee's mind remained focused, her instincts honed to a razor's edge. She calculated trajectories, predicted enemy movements, and acted without hesitation. She moved with a single-minded purpose, to protect those who depended on her. Hours passed and the enemy finally began to retreat. The valley was littered with debris, spent casings, and the remnants of the battlefield. Lee's squad had survived, but the cost was evident in their bloodied uniforms, trembling hands, and haunted eyes. She gathered them together, checking for injuries, offering quiet words of encouragement, and ensuring that every soldier had made it through alive. For a moment, there was relief, a brief, fragile respite in the aftermath of chaos. But Lee knew it was temporary. War had a way of returning, of testing resolve, of demanding sacrifices. And she knew that, despite their survival, the choices she had made, staying behind for the wounded, acting on instinct, trusting her own judgment over orders, would continue to shape the lives of her squad and her own path forward. That night Lee sat alone once more, her uniform torn and bloodied, the metal pressed against her chest. She reflected on the events of the day, the fear, the chaos, the courage, and the sacrifice. She realized that the mission had not only tested her skill and instinct, but had also forced her to confront the core of her humanity. Sometimes duty was not about following orders. Sometimes it was about love, about responsibility, about staying behind when it was easier to move on, about protecting those who could not protect themselves, even if it meant placing yourself in harm's way. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the weight of the metal and the memory it carried. It was proof of her choices, her courage, and her humanity. Proof that, even in the darkest moments, she had acted not out of fear or obligation, but out of love. And in that quiet moment, Lee Monroe understood something profound. Sometimes, the greatest act of duty was not in the orders followed, the battles won, or the missions completed. Sometimes, it was simply in the choice to stay behind, to carry the weight of others, and to act when no one else could. She looked out over the valley one last time, the moonlight fading into dawn, and allowed herself a single, quiet breath. The mission was not over, the war would continue, but for now she had done what was necessary. And sometimes that was enough. Why did silence feel heavier than any gunfire? The battlefield had been left behind, but its echoes clung to Lee Monroe's mind like smoke. Every step through the base, every glance at her squad, reminded her that survival came at a price she could never fully calculate. Soldiers whispered in the corridors, eyes following her, some with awe, some with suspicion, some with gratitude too hesitant to speak aloud. Torres approached her, helmet slung carelessly over her shoulder, dirt streaked across her face. There was a pause, a moment pregnant with unspoken words. Then she said simply, "You stayed behind for them, all of them. You didn't have to." Lee looked at her, eyes steady. "I did." Torres nodded, and for the first time Lee caught the glimmer of respect in her eyes. But it was tempered by the fear and tension of what had come before, the ambush, the mistrust, the questioning. That tension would linger. Trust was a fragile, precious thing, and it had been tested to its limits. Rios, Hale, and the other soldiers gathered around, their faces weary but alive. Each one carried scars, some visible, others etched deep in memory. Lee scanned the group, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on her chest. She had guided them, protected them, even when it had meant facing unimaginable risk. But now she faced the aftermath, the quiet reckoning that comes after the chaos of combat. The debrief was relentless. Colonel Draven's office felt colder than any battlefield she had ever been on. Reports were filed, questions asked, orders scrutinized. Lee answered each one with measured precision, revealing enough to satisfy protocol but withholding the inner truths she knew could never be shared. Omega had left its mark, its training etched into her mind, teaching her that some truths were weapons, some secrets shields. Draven studied her silently, eyes hard. "You acted decisively," he said finally. "Too decisively, some might say." Lee's throat tightened. "I did what was necessary." He leaned back in his chair, studying her like a calculus problem he couldn't solve. "Necessary is subjective, Lieutenant. And yet, everyone under your command survived. That is undeniable." She allowed herself a small exhale, a fraction of the tension leaving her body. Recognition from Draven was not praise. It never had been, but it was acknowledgement. And sometimes acknowledgement was enough. Later, Lee walked the perimeter again, moonlight painting the base in silver and shadow. She traced the ridge where the ambush had occurred, remembering every shot, every scream, every split-second decision that had saved lives. Her fingers brushed against the metal hidden beneath her uniform. It was small, almost insignificant, yet it carried the weight of every choice she had made, every life she had preserved. Rios joined her silently, leaning against the railing. "You know," he said softly, "I don't think any of us will ever look at a battlefield the same way again." Lee nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Battles were not about glory or medals. They were about survival, about courage, about making choices no one else could or would make. They were about love disguised as duty. "Sometimes," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "the hardest choice is the one no one sees, the one that doesn't get reported, the one that doesn't get a medal or a commendation, the choice to stay behind to protect others, even if it means you might not make it out." Rios didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, the weight of her words settling in his chest. Days passed and the mission moved forward. Lee continued to lead, to protect, to endure. Each day was a reminder that survival was not just about her own instincts. It was about the bond she had forged with her squad. Hale, Torres, Rios, and the others had become more than colleagues. They had become mirrors of her courage, reflections of the choices she had made, and witnesses to the quiet strength she carried. In the quiet moments when the sun dipped below the horizon and the base fell into a fragile calm, Lee reflected on everything she had endured. Omega, the ambush, the relentless pressure of command, and she realized that her strength was not in her skill, not in her reflexes, not even in her courage, it was in her humanity. Her ability to care, to act, to sacrifice. She pressed the medal to her chest again, feeling its weight. It was proof, a reminder that love and duty were not mutually exclusive. Sometimes they were inseparable. The squad gathered for a final briefing before their next mission, but Lee lingered at the edge, observing them. Each one carried the scars of combat, both visible and invisible. She knew they trusted her now, not blindly, but with the kind of respect earned through shared hardship. Torres approached her, standing close enough to speak without being overheard. "I wasn't sure about you at first," she admitted, voice low. "But you proved it, all of it. You stayed behind when most would have run. You didn't just survive, you saved us." Lee allowed herself a small, tight smile. "I only did what had to be done." Rio stepped forward, a tentative smile breaking through his exhaustion. "And we'll follow you anywhere, ma'am. Not because we have to, but because we know you'll never let us down." Hale's nod was quiet, measured, but it carried the same message. Respect earned through action, trust built in the crucible of chaos. Lee felt a rare warmth in her chest, a fragile hope that perhaps, despite everything, they would make it through the trials ahead together. The night before redeployment, Lee found herself alone once more, sitting on the edge of the ridge, the valley stretched out below her. The moon had risen high, bathing the landscape in silver, highlighting the jagged rocks and the gentle curve of the river that cut through the valley. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind, the distant hum of the base, the faint heartbeat of the world beyond the battlefield. Memories of the ambush flickered through her mind, the terrified faces of her squad, the flashes of gunfire, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her chest. And yet, amidst the fear and exhaustion, she felt something else, a quiet pride. Not in victory, not in accolades, not in recognition, but in the knowledge that she had stayed behind when it mattered most, that she had acted when others could not, that she had carried love disguised as duty, and in doing so had preserved life, trust, and humanity. She opened her eyes, staring at the valley below, the stars reflected in the river, tiny sparks of light in the darkness. She pressed the medal to her chest one last time, whispering a promise to herself and to those she had protected. I will always stay. I will always act. I will never let them down. Morning came, and with it, the squad prepared for deployment. Lee stood at the front, surveying the team. Every face told a story: fear, exhaustion, determination, and trust. She felt the weight of command, the responsibility of each life under her watch, and the quiet knowledge that the choices she had made would echo far beyond this mission. The transport rotor's whirred, shaking the ground. Soldiers moved with purpose, packing gear, checking weapons, preparing for whatever lay ahead. Lee adjusted her helmet, her fingers brushing the metal once more. It was small, almost insignificant to anyone else. But to her, it carried every lesson, every sacrifice, every act of love disguised as duty. As the squad boarded, Hale gave her a slight nod. Torres gave a small, tight smile. Rios's eyes met hers, filled with gratitude and unspoken understanding. And Lee knew, without doubt, that they would face the next battle together, stronger for what they had endured. The transport lifted off, the valley receding beneath them. Lee pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the pulse of life, the rhythm of hope, and the quiet certainty that sometimes the greatest act of duty was not in orders followed, battles won, or missions completed. Sometimes it was simply in staying behind, carrying the weight of others, and acting when no one else could. And in that quiet, unspoken truth, Lee Monroe found peace. The valley lay silent below, the shadows of night receding, but the echoes of courage, love, and sacrifice remained, etched into the earth and into the hearts of those who had survived. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And sometimes, love is the quietest, strongest weapon a soldier can carry. The sun rose, casting gold across the horizon. Lee looked out, helmet glinting in the light, squad beside her, and allowed herself a single, steady breath. The world was still dangerous, still chaotic, still uncertain. But she had stayed behind, she had acted, she had carried the weight of others, and that was enough. The legacy of her choice would endure, not in medals, not in reports, not in stories told aloud, but in the lives she had preserved, in the trust she had forged, and in the quiet, unwavering strength that had defined her. And as the squad moved forward into the unknown, Lee Monroe understood the truth she had carried all along. Sometimes, the greatest act of duty is silent, invisible, and profoundly human. And in that silence, she had found herself.